It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. In the late 13th century, Scotland was plunged into crisis following the death of Alexander III at the age of 44, who left behind only an infant granddaughter, Margaret, Maid of Norway. As she was being ferried over from her native Scandinavia to Scotland via Orkney, which belonged to the Norwegian crown, she took ill and died at St. Margaret's Hope. Her death led to a legal dispute between rival claimants to the throne known as the Great Cause, which was fought primarily between Robert Bruce and John Balliol. Edward I of England had a reputation for justice and was invited to arbitrate. Eventually, John Balliol was crowned King of Scots in 1292. Balliol reigned until 1296, when Edward decided, after successfully subduing the Welsh, to hammer the Scots and revoke the blessing he had conferred on John's kingship. He defeated the Scots at Dunbar that year and took Edinburgh Castle. Meanwhile, Scots nobles mobilised against Edward, the most famous of whom was William Wallace, who defeated the English at Stirling, only for them to hit back at Falkirk, ushering in years of dependency. During Alexander's reign, relations with the English were peaceful on the whole, and treaties were worked out so that Scottish nobles holding lands below the border were subject to Scots law, and English nobles with fiefs north of the border were under English jurisdiction. He was a successful king who established royal authority over the Highlands and Hebrides, which had formerly been under Norwegian influence. Alexander's sons by Margaret of England, who was Edward I's sister, died young, and so did his daughter, also called Margaret, but not before producing another Margaret by King Eric II of Norway. Margaret of England died in 1275, and Alexander married Yolande of Dreux. While he was staying at Edinburgh Castle and his wife at Kinghorn in Fife, he spontaneously decided to ride across the Firth of Forth in order to spend the night with Yolande before her birthday. He was warned against this due to the stormy conditions, but pressed on regardless. Alexander got separated from the party in the thick mists and was discovered next morning at the bottom of a cliff with a broken neck. A council of guardians was convened, consisting of 2 earls, 2 barons, and 2 bishops, who negotiated the 3-year-old Margaret of Norway's succession and betrothal to Edward I of England's son, her second cousin. When Margaret of Norway died in Orkney on her journey from Scandinavia to Scotland, Edward mediated the succession and determined that John Balliol had the better claim versus Robert Bruce, who was the grandfather of the Bruce. 4 years later, he decided to revoke this decision and rule Scotland for himself, marching north and defeating the Scots at Dunbar. The rebel William Wallace fought back and won the Battle of Stirling Bridge for Scotland. This was only a temporary victory, and the Scots lost decisively at Falkirk. Wallace fled the battle but was captured in 1305 for high treason, even though he had no obligation to the English crown, and war crimes. His atrocities against civilians during war were real enough, however, as he had devastated the borders in northern England after his victory at Stirling, burning crops and settlements, and murdering the populace indiscriminately. Scotland was without a king from 1296. Balliol was forced to abdicate by Edward I, the same man who had made him monarch 4 years previously. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and eventually retired to France. In 1306, the ambitious Robert the Bruce saw the opportunity in a reduced English presence and murdered his rival for the Scottish throne, John Comyn. Soon after, he was crowned King of Scots. The following year, Edward I died, and his son Edward II became the English king. He was much less the leader than his father, and largely left Scotland alone in the first 7 years of his reign. This gave Robert the Bruce time to build up his strength without the pressure of an imminent English invasion. Edward decided to march north, however, in 1314, when Bruce demanded that the English surrender the occupied Stirling Castle by Midsummer's Day. The English troops relieved the castle, but wanted a battle to finish the issue once and for all. On the first day of the Battle of Bannockburn, Henry de Bohun, the nephew of the Earl of Hereford, one of the English commanders, spotted Bruce on horseback in the fray and made a valiant attempt to slay him in single combat. Bruce brought his mace down over Henry's head, killing him. This boosted Scottish morale, and drove the English away temporarily. On the second day, the Scots capitalised on their momentum and went on the offensive, routing the English army with their schiltrons of spearmen in tight formation. It was an overwhelming victory, and many English nobles were captured for ransom, and many infantry slaughtered. Robert the Bruce had driven out the English, but he still had to gain recognition of Scotland from the rest of Europe as an independent kingdom. To be accepted as an equal member of Christendom's family of nations, he had to win over the Pope, who had excommunicated him for the murder of John Comyn. The Declaration of Arbroath of 1320 was a letter to Rome, asserting Scottish self-determination. It was signed by 38 of Scotland's most important nobles, as well as the then Earl of Orkney, Magnus Jonsson. Some have argued that the Declaration asserts the sovereignty of the people versus the English tradition of a sovereign parliament, and it has been compared with the freedom-ensuring Magna Carta of 1215 in that regard. It has inspired Scottish nationalists in the 20th and 21st centuries, including the SNP's Alex Salmond and the writer and artist Alistair Gray. The Battle of Bannockburn is considered by some to be Scotland's moment of national glory. It typifies much that comprises Scottish identity today, particularly an antagonism with the English that has never subsided despite 700 years of history. One of the most famous depictions of William Wallace is in the film Braveheart, and the film is also famous for its glaring inaccuracies. The line, "They may take our lives, but they will never take our freedom," has no basis in historical fact, but there is ample precedent in the Declaration of Arbroath to superimpose this sentiment.